Alright, boys, we're here to look at the results from last Sunday's challenge. Uh, looks like in first place we actually have Mono Red Kuldotha. This is pretty interesting. We did see in the last video that on Saturday there was a blue-black strategy that was actually cutting some unexpected fangs. And there was, some of the Gates strategies were not having the, main deck suffocating fumes. So I think that the meta has maybe gotten to a spot where Mono Red is actually kind of good again. So this list is pretty interesting. It's got only one Fire Blast main, which is pretty interesting. I think all the lists I've seen before have had two, but I think this is actually pretty reasonable because drawing double Fire Blast is one of the worst things that can happen with this deck, especially if you're having like one Great Furnace or God forbid, 2 Great Furnaces in your draw. It's actually going down to 3 Kessig Flame Breathers. I think this is actually pretty reasonable, replacing it with a Goblin Bushwhacker. This card can be pretty clunky. It is susceptible to removal and being tempo inefficient against removal, like Lightning Bolt, like Blue Blast, like Snuff Out. I mean, Snuff Out is not really a problem for this deck, but my point still stands. It's not the most efficient threat to play out on turn 2, and Bushwhacker can lead to some really explosive plays where you're able to go like Kuldotha into Bushwhacker and just hit out of nowhere for 8 damage, which is pretty scary against a lot of decks. And then in terms of the sideboard, it's got 3 End the Festivities. This is basically probably the best card in the mirror match, so I think it makes sense to play a lot of those. It also is fairly good against Kage. Even if it is just killing one guy, it can be totally fine, and it obviously single-handedly destroys any sort of bully strategy. If your opponent plays Battle Screech and you untap and play End the Festivities, they've probably lost the game. A couple Gorillas, couple Smash. It's interesting that he goes for the 2-2 split here. I guess not wanting to leave the power of Gorilla Shaman on the bench, but also wanting to have some ways to deal with Enforcers. Couple Molten Rains, which is, I think I've come around on this card a bit. I think it is pretty good in the Gates matchup, especially with the Carves list running even a Azorius Chancery. It can just be pretty nice to take out their Basilisk Gate or potentially even a colored source if they're having like a, maybe a blue light or a white light draw. You're able to mana screw them potentially, and this deck can obviously take advantage of opponent's mana screw very, very well. 3 Pyros, pretty interesting. 3 Relics. I guess this is also to hit the blue-black Tolarian Terror deck. Can do a pretty good job, especially if you're able to land it early, like turn 1, turn 2. It can actually be pretty annoying for the Tolarian Terror deck to deal with. They have to have a much more explosive draw, and they have to be very careful about when they play their Mental Notes and Thought Scours, instead of just being able to, like, play it out. And even slowing them down for like 1 turn can be enough for this deck, where you're able to maybe burn them out before they're putting lifelink on one of their big guys. And let's see, so in second place we have Boros Synth here. Let's see, this looks like pretty standard, basically the same list we saw in the other challenge. 1 Relic main, 2 Journey, 2 Makeshift Munitions, 20 lands. I think this is basically just the same list. I guess the sideboard here is a little bit different because I don't think we saw a list that played 2 dust. No, wait, actually we did see the list that played 2 Leave No Trace, 2 Dust. We did literally see that. Yeah, so I'm pretty sure this is just exactly the same list that we saw before. It's interesting they go with a Lorehold Campus, only 3 Great Furnace. I guess they're trying to play around Dust a little bit. So they're only having 9 artifact lands, which I guess is enough for Galvanic Blast. They do have the 1 Relic main deck, 4 Wellspring, 4 Synth, so I guess it should be fine. And they have the Thraben Inspector, which can help turn on Metalcraft as well. Lorehold Campus is pretty interesting. I guess it can be good in those spots when you're out of juice and you just need to find that one last Galvanic Blast to get over the finish line. 3 Garrison. That is one thing I do love about these decks, is that they're able to play the bounce lands and they're able to use it pretty effectively. 1 Bojuka Bog. That is an interesting inclusion. So it's almost like they're playing like 19 lands, but I guess it does make mana. It can help you cast Wellspring or whatever, or Seeker, Skyfisher, stuff like that. But it's obviously does not make any colored mana for this deck, so that's kind of interesting to note. We got Amplum Nox getting third with Kagate here. This looks like the Carves list. Yeah, it's pretty standard stuff. He's going with the 1 Suffocating. Interesting. 1 Flare. 3 Predator, 3 Brainstorm. This looks like the Carves list. Pretty standard with the Corsair. And the, the tech with Standard Bearer for the mirror. Couple Dusts, actually, complement his Gorillas. We did not see this in the other list. They were playing an additional Blue Blast, and I forget what the other card they were playing was, but 2 Dust was not present in the list that we saw in the other challenge. But other than that, this is pretty standard list. He is going with the Chancery, 2 Ash Barons, total of 8 gates. He's not actually having any Azorius Guild gates. 1 Heap Gate, 4 Island, 2 Plains, 2 Ash Barons. Okay, it's pretty standard stuff here. And then let's take a look at Backoff's list. This is the other variant that we saw where they're playing the Fumes main deck, only the 10 creatures, maxing out the cantrips, 2 Spell Pierce instead of the 4 spikes, no Azorius Chancery. This is sort of the other, these are basically the 2 different versions of Kagate. They're pretty similar, but they do have a little bit of slight differences. This one is maxing out on Dust, having 2 Relics and 4 Blasts of each, and 1 Arms of Hadar. Pretty standard, pretty generic. Pelin top. Let's see what this guy's playing. So this looks like the same list we just looked at. Yeah, except he's got a little bit of interesting tech in the sideboard here. With the 1 Destroy Evil, 5 Hydros. He's actually cutting a Dust for a Revoke Existence. I guess they wanted to tech a little bit more for Bogle's matchups, or have some stuff for problematic enchantments like Makeshift Munitions, maybe out of a deck that doesn't play too many red cards, so you don't really want to bring in like something like this. Maybe for something like the Black Cats deck, that could be a little bit better than the Blue Blast in that sort of matchup. And then let's see, we got Boros Bully. This list is actually playing a Dawnbringer. I think the list we saw in the other challenge did not play a Dawnbringer, so it's pretty interesting. They're not going with the Electrickeries in this list either. They are having the Journeys for a bit of extra hard removal to actually out big problematic creatures. Sideboard is pretty similar to the other one though. Oh, I guess another difference is that this deck is not playing any main deck Guardians, whereas the other list we saw was actually playing 4 main deck Guardians, which I thought was pretty interesting. I guess I'm not sure which one of those I think is better. I haven't played very much with the Bully strategy, so I don't have a very informed opinion on it, to be honest. And let's see, there's a Flaring Pain, a Revoke, a Dawnbringer, 2 Relics, 3 Pyros, 2 Electrickeries. This looks pretty standard, pretty straight up. This is definitely a more generic version of Bully than the one that we saw in the other challenge. That one had a lot more new ideas going on with no removal except for Electrickeries in the main deck and 4 copies of Guardian in the main deck. I thought that was pretty interesting, but looks like regular Bully is just totally fine. Still able to go 5-1 into the top 8 here. We got Gruul Ponza by Capip 95. 4 Arborov, 4 Jewel Thief. Jewel Thief is an interesting card. I guess this has been sort of adopted as one of the standard creatures in that deck now. I never really liked it, but I guess it does a good job of pressuring, and it can ramp out the big beaters as well. Obviously, running 4 Avenging Hunter, this is one of the better cards in the strategy, one of the reasons to play it right now. And then actually cutting an Annoyed Altasaur, which is an interesting development in the Ponza strategies. And this one's actually playing Lightning Bolt. Some decks do not play Lightning Bolt. Some of the Ponza strategies do not play Lightning Bolt, but this player does look like they're playing Lightning Bolt. And they're actually going with a Stone Rain because 4 Thermocars, 4 Acid Moss just wasn't enough. And I think this is a pretty interesting list here. They're only having the 4 Deglams, so, and the 2 Gorillas. So they are having a decent bit of affinity hate. A couple Relics is, I guess, their plan for Terror. I guess other than that, they do have a decent bit of creatures that can trade with it and get value, like Boarding Party, Altasaur, Avenging Hunter. But I can't imagine that matchup is super favorable for this strategy. Though I guess you can definitely cheese some games with just a turn 2 Stone Rain on their tap land. And that deck is pretty land light, so they can sometimes just lose to the cheese like that. 4 Weathers, 3 Fiery Cannonades. I guess this is probably for gates. You can destroy all their creatures at like instant speed, which can be pretty nice in response to like a gate activation. 4 Weathers is pretty good against red. Can definitely give you some game there, but I think red is probably still favored in this matchup. But yeah, I think this is pretty standard list. I think we've seen a lot of lists like this before. And I think it's definitely a player in the metagame. Definitely a pretty strong deck in the metagame. We got Ocean Soul 92 on Affinity here. It's actually having the Krark Clan main deck. I've seen a lot of lists lately cutting Krark Clan. He's going with a Gear Seeker as well. This is pretty interesting. I think this card is actually fairly well positioned in the meta. It does sort of win out the arms race with affinity creatures. Like, if you're having this and your opponent's having Angler, you know, your creature just dominates it, so that is obviously pretty nice. It is also pretty good against the Tolarian Terror strategies. Obviously, they are going to have Snuff Outs, and this card is pretty vulnerable to Snuff Out. A lot more so than Angler, where Angler's not able to get hit by it. And Enforcer, who also costs 0 mana, so is trading tempo even with Snuff Out. But Gear Seeker's actually taking a pretty big tempo loss if it gets Snuff Outed. 3 Reckoners. Sorry, I thought that was Metallic Rebuke in my head for some reason. So 4 Metallic Rebukes, 3 Reckoners, 2 Thoughtcast. So he's only actually on 9 card draw spells. 1 Cast Down, 1 Chainers, 4 Blast, 3 Blood Fountains. This has been something that Walker's been playing a lot, is only 3 Blood Fountains. 4 Star, 4 Wellspring, 2 Munish, 19 lands. Looks like they're going with actually 10 tap lands here and then 9 untapped lands. It's kind of an interesting split. I think Walker's lists have been playing 10 untapped lands and 9 tap lands, so it's a little bit interesting to see the inverse here. As far as the sideboard goes, we got 3 Hydros, 2 Gorillas, 3 Nile Spellbombs. That's kind of a lot, but I guess it can be pretty strong in the mirror. It's not bad versus Kagate, and it can be pretty good against, I mean, I don't know, I wouldn't say pretty good. It can be playable against Tolarian Terror decks. 1 Chainers, 2 Fangs, 2 Arms, and 2 Spell Pierce. I think Spell Pierce is actually pretty reasonable attack against Dust to Dust strategies. Though, the thing about Spell Pierce and Metallic Rebuke against Dust to Dust strategies is that you are still kind of on a clock, because you have to really make something happen before they're able to just get up to like 5 or 6 mana and start playing through your counterspells. Because once they are able to dust through your counterspells, it can be pretty annoying. Especially if you like miss land drops or stumble in the early game, it's obviously a nightmare. But if you are able to like deploy multiple Enforcers, get some hits in, play a early Angler, early Gear Seeker, and get some hits in, you can be in a pretty good spot. And even making them dust Enforcers, especially if you're able to have like Deadly or Reckoners up to sack in response, and then be able to get it back later with Blood Fountain, can be really nice. And just allowing the deck to not get cheesed out so hard by turn 3 dust is definitely pretty valuable, so I like Spell Pierce for that. It definitely does a good job of that. So I think this is pretty reasonable, and maybe something I'll have to try out in my affinity list. And then, of course, 9th, we talked about this deck before. Let's see if there's any changes. It looks like it's just the same deck. I guess he is trying out a Mold Folk. He's going down on 1 Weather, and he's trying out Twin Silk Spider as well. So this is fairly interesting stuff here that Against is doing with the mono black strategy. So, you know, this is pretty cool. It's cool to see. This is like sort of a newish archetype. Definitely a newish take on the mono black. It's kind of reminiscent of the USP dudes that we saw a couple months ago, the USP dudes list that USP dudes made. But it is a little bit different. It's not playing any sort of Crypt Rats effect. And it is still using the Colony Garden with the Reckoners and Deadly system that Does seem to work pretty well in terms of black card draw. It seems to be like the way to go. If you want to play a mid-rangey black deck, you're probably going to want to be packing Colony Gardens. You're probably going to be want to be packing your Deadly Disputes and Reckoner's Bargains, along with, of course, Acre Wellsprings. He did cut the Chromatic Star for another Blood Fountain here, which is, I think, pretty reasonable. I think Blood Fountain should be pretty strong. You can get back the Thorns or the DLZs or the Anglers. I think that was one of the issues that I ran into with the black decks as well, was that they're fairly threat light, so it can definitely come up where just all of your creatures get answered, all your Vamps get answered, all your Gurmags get answered. You only have one Blood Fountain in the other list, so it's only like a total of 7 threats. So it's like not super unreasonable for them to just all die, and then, you know, you're stuck trying to beat down with Dusk Legion Zealots and Thorn of the Black Rose, which is not exactly easy to do. But yeah, so that will be it. Thanks for watching, boys. Make sure to click the subscribe button down below. Check out the link down below if you want to follow me on Twitch or Twitter, whatever. And thanks for watching, boys.